The educator in you is trying to warn the world of two dangers.
He's trying to do what?
Trying to warn the world about two present dangers. One is nuclear proliferation, and the other is climate change, where you find yourself butting your head against your fellow Republicans on this topic. You have two phrases for these topics in your book. One, progress can drift away. And second, prepare for the worst, aim for the best. What do you mean by those?
Well, I already said something about nuclear weapons. They're proliferating. And I went over to Livermore Labs about 3 years ago with Sid Drell, the late Sid Drell. He's one of our great physicists. His office at Hoover was right down the hall from mine. We talked, we were great friends. And so they could tell me anything about physics I wouldn't know, but they couldn't kid Sid. So we go over there, and the scientist showing us around was a friend of Sid's, and he had a new 3D printer. He was like a kid with a new toy. He's telling us all the things he could do with his printer. And he says to Sid, "You give my fissile material, I can program this machine to make a nuclear weapon." In other words, the science and art of turning fissile material into a weapon is known. It's a very dangerous time we're living in. Great tension between India and Pakistan. What will happen to North Korea, who knows? But you have to say to yourself, if a country as backward as North Korea can make a nuclear weapon, it's not so hard. So I worry about that a lot, because a nuclear exchange is a global event. Then I worry about climate change. It is happening. Sorry, Mr. Trump, it's happening. We had a conference at Hoover about a year ago, and we published a book, which you can have get if you want. It's called Beyond Disruption. And there's an article in it by Lucy Shapiro and her husband. Lucy is a biologist, and she's the smartest person in any room she's in, and she's also fun. But she writes this very powerful article with her husband, who's a physicist. And it says, tropical diseases are moving north. As it gets warmer, tropical diseases move north. So we should be getting up our diagnostics. We should get our treatment, be prepared. And furthermore, we know a lot about gene editing now. We should get some of these mosquitoes and try to edit the genes so they're not so dangerous. And furthermore, the warmer oceans are eroding the reefs. The Great Barrier Reef in Australia has changed. The reefs in the Caribbean are changed. And they're all part of the food chain. So that's going to have a big effect on the food that's coming out of the ocean. So these are things we should act on. So I think never mind arguing whether the climate is changing or not, you can see the results of it. Here we are in California. The evaporation makes us dry as tinder. So we have these fires and so on. So I think it's something we need to do something about. And I'm glad to say that the scientists are doing a lot to learn how to create energy that's better. And I've been advocating a revenue-neutral carbon tax as a policy to get at this and say, let's dim down on the regulations that have the government tell you, do this, do that. Put a price out there and let the market sort things out, and that'll work. And make it revenue neutral, so it isn't financing a government program, and it's no fiscal drag connected with it, and people get a dividend. So those are my policy proposals. But we've had a interesting relationship with MIT. And Susan Hockfield, when she was president of MIT, she was my friend. And we said, look, let's work on game changers. So we brought 12 MIT scientists here, and I got about the same number of Stanford. I got one from Berkeley and one from Livermore. And we spent 2 days talking about game changer technologies, different scientists telling things they're doing. And it was very productive. Then we had a similar kind of meeting at MIT about a little while later. Then we took our act to Washington. John Boehner was Speaker of the House. I got him to set us up with the Republicans on the House Energy Committee. These were supposed to be the bad guys, right? Well, selling them energy R&D was an absolute piece of cake, no problem. So that was interesting. And but as soon as you said, okay, somebody's invented something, so let the government now turn it into a business, and you lose everybody, including me. So I said to Ernie Moniz, who was Secretary of Energy, who I knew, I said, Ernie, let your energy R&D have the D go as far as showing that something is doable and scalable, and then let the market take over. And then you'll get your support, which has been there, but not as much as it ought to be. At any rate, in a month or so, we're about to have another meeting because the scientists think that enough has happened since the first. We wrote a book, Bob Armstrong from MIT and I did, called Game Changers. But we think there's now enough. So this time, instead of having it here at MIT, we're going to have it in Washington. We're going to invite Washington people to come and listen. And we're not arguing climate change. We're just saying, here are things happening in the energy space. Solar energy is now very inexpensive. But we're really making headway on large-scale storage. Large-scale storage is the holy grail here because it takes away the intermittency problem of wind and solar energy. Because you put it into the storage when it's produced, take it out when it's wanted. And it's large enough scale that you can even make baseload electricity out of it. There are other things like that. So we're about to do that. And that's fun to do, and I hope it'll be effective.
Let's see a show of hands. How many of you would like to be a cabinet secretary at some point in your life? Okay. How many of you would like to teach at MIT or Stanford or University of Chicago? How many of you would like to run a large corporation like Bechtel? Not bad. All right. So there is an old joke. It's too old for your generation, but his generation and my generation know it. The joke is, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? And the answer is practice, 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 practice. So in front of this audience of people who want to be...
I think the answer is be lucky.
Yes. Is that the Yogi Berra line about 90% of life is showing up or something like that? You have an audience of people who want to be George Shultz. So the question is, how does one get to be George Shultz?
Well, I had my Marine Corps experience. I told you about that. And then I decided for a career, I wanted to study economics because I'm a child of the Great Depression. And the problem was the economics. So I said, that's the subject matter I want to get involved in. And I'd like to become a PhD in economics and teach at a good university, do my research, and if I get a chance to serve in the government, I would serve in the government. So I went to MIT, great place, and I get invited to serve as a staff, so-called senior staff economist at President Eisenhower's Council of Economic Advisors. It was a great year. Went to Washington, I learned a lot from that experience, but I also met people, including Vice President Nixon and his very close friend Arthur Burns. So Nixon's second effort at being president was in 1968. I'm out here at the Center for Advanced Studies. You know, this is a center. You come, they have about 40 people, and you have no duties, you just do whatever you want. So it was nice, and we were here. And I was asked by Arthur Burns if I would form a little task force to make recommendations to President Nixon if he were elected on what to do in the labor management relations area and in the wage price type problems that a lot of people thought emanated from it. So I got a few good people together, and the day after the election, we had our report in. So then I got a telephone call from Arthur Burns saying, if the president calls me and asks me to be Secretary of Labor, would I accept? So I talked it over with my family, And I said, yeah, that's the subject I know quite a bit about, and I'd be glad to serve. So then the president calls me and asks me, and I said, yes. And then he said, don't say anything about it because we're going to announce all my cabinet choices at one time. So we're all going to come secretly to a hotel in Washington. It'll be like the Super Bowl. Now I give you my Secretary of State. Now I give you my Secretary of Treasury, and so on. So, big deal. So I said, well, Mr. President, then, but no announcement. How about at any time for a personal meeting? He said, well, I'll be in Los Angeles next Monday. You come down there. So I made an appointment. And I spent the weekend thinking to myself, what kind of a Secretary of Labor am I going to be? I know a lot about this subject, and I have views on different things like racial discrimination, like unions, like a whole bunch of things, labor disputes and emergency disputes. So I went down with the idea, if I'm going to tell him what he's getting, and if he doesn't like it, it hasn't been announced, he can go on to somebody else. So we went through all these things, and he agreed with everything, so I said, fine. So I started as Secretary of Labor, and I had been very critical as a professor at the University of Chicago of the Johnson and Kennedy administration interventions in labor disputes. They declared any big labor dispute to be a threat to the national interest, and they intervened, and you didn't get it settled until you got to the White House. And I said, you're overestimating the danger that it does, and you're ruining private bargaining. Because if I know I'm going to the White House in the end, I don't make my best offer till I get there, right? So that means private bargaining is being ruined. And that was my argument. So there was a strike on the East and Gulf Coast longshoremen around July of 1968. And President Johnson joined the strike under Taft-Hartley. And under Taft-Hartley, there is the possibility of a fast-track appeal to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court agreed with the president, so the injunction held. It expired in the middle of January 1969, and I'm sworn in labor, Secretary of Labor a few days later, and the press says, okay, Professor Shultz, now you're Secretary of Labor. What are you going to do? So I went to the president and I said, who was preoccupied with Vietnam and all this, I said, Mr. President, this strike will cause a lot of kerfuffle in New York City, and they think that's a national emergency, but it isn't. There's a lot of resilience in the economy, and if you can hold out for 4 to 5 weeks until the parties get it through their head they're not coming to the White House, I can get this dispute settled. And so he stuck with me, and we got it settled. And it was a big deal, and we haven't had those kind of interventions since. Very important moment. But it gave me credibility. So then I had various other things that were controversial, and he supported me. And then he appointed me, as I said earlier, to this job as managing the desegregation of the schools. So I had a good experience with President Nixon.
On June 25th, 1982, Ronald Reagan nominates you to be Secretary of State. 25 days later, you were confirmed by the Senate on a 97-0 vote. That was a day after the Foreign Relations Committee had unanimously confirmed you as well. Today, confirmations are blood sport. The process people have to go through in terms of their finances, in terms of their paperwork, is overwhelming. Some people will not participate because they don't want to go through the hurdles. They don't want to stick around and get caught up in it. How do you fix the system right now, Secretary Shultz? How do we get back to the day when we could get things done relatively speedily and good people could get jobs in government?
I think it's a hard problem, but let me tell you something I've been supporting. It's an organization called With Valor. And the idea is to get veterans to run for Congress. And we've been making headway. And we don't care whether Republicans, Democrats, Independents, whatever, if they're a veteran, get them in there. Because a veteran has come to see that there's leadership and there's followership. You get it, and you're there and you're in combat. You got a problem to solve, and you got a problem. It's a team. In the end, you have to settle things and go on. So we get people with that mindset into Congress, it'll change. And we're beginning to make headway. So that's one thing. But I think it's people are getting lessons, and I also think we're maybe seeing a kind of federalization, a new federalization take place, where people are saying, let's devolve power a little bit more to states and cities, not have everything in Washington. Because a lot of things Washington is doing, we don't like. I know here I am in California, and there's a woman over in Oakland who's been here for 20 years or so. She came illegally. She has 3 children. 2 of them graduated, they have jobs. She's working as a nurse in Oakland, doing a fine job, no problems. There's one younger child. They deport her. They deport her because she violated the law 20 years ago. And you say to yourself, this is not us. And you say to yourself, we want to do things our way, not your way. And so I think there's a tendency to say, let's devolve more power down where the people are and do it our way. And actually, if you look at the history of our country, that is the way the Constitution was set up. Because, we almost didn't have a country for a while. It took about 6 years to the end of the Revolution until we got a Constitution. Because the states said, look, we just threw off London as a ruler. Why do we want to have another one? And then gradually they came together, and Washington agreed to be chairman of a constitutional convention, and people came to him. But there's another thing that I hadn't realized until I was reading some of our history. In the Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War, the United States was granted all of the territory east of the Mississippi River. There's a huge amount of new geography for the United States. So the states had to somehow figure out how's that going to get settled and what are going to be the conditions. So we had something in common. We had the Revolutionary War in common, then we had this in common, so it helped. But the Constitution is very clear that power was to be devolved. And I think maybe that's starting to happen, not only here, but elsewhere as well.
I would like you to ask questions. Secretary Shultz, we have microphones we'll hand out. So raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. But I'm going to ask you one final question in the meantime, Secretary. When you worked at the State Department, you would get to work at 5:30 in the morning, read cables, catch up on paperwork, be prepared for the day. You would work 13-hour days. But I recall you saying one time that when you visited President Eisenhower, I think this was close before he passed away, and you went to visit him before you were going to take over the Labor Department, you asked him for advice. And his advice was, play golf.
Well,
so the question is this, sir. What is the balance between work and recreation? How hard should one work, and also how should one set up outlets?
President Eisenhower, as I mentioned earlier, I was at his Council of Economic Advisors. I didn't know him, but had experiences with him. But anyway, I was told that if I wanted an appointment with him, he would see me. So naturally, I made an appointment right away. He was in Walter Reed Hospital. He died about 5 months later. But he was very genial. And we started talking about the Department of Labor. I was astonished at how much he knew about it. And it dawned on me, if you're going to be effective in ruling up here, you got to know what's going on down here, and he did. That was one of the reasons why he was effective as a general and as a president. So then we started talking about golf, and he loved golf. And we had played a couple of courses, the same courses, and we talked about them. Then he described the Augusta National Golf Club to me, hole by hole, and we're having a great time. And a doctor comes in after about 3/4 of an hour and says, enough. Then this genial man gets very stern, waves his finger in my face like this, and he says, young man, you're going to come down here and you're going to work 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you're going to think you're doing your job. Let me tell you something. If that's what you do, there's no way you can do your job. You just burn yourself out. Said, I can see you like golf as much as I do. If you're going to get on some golf course at least twice a week, get your mind on something else. You won't be able to do your job. So he says, the press will get on you for it, but they don't understand these things. The press was always on him for getting too much golf. But there was the Gridiron Club, it's a meeting every year in Washington where the press joshes the powers that be. So when Eisenhower was elected, nobody was too sure what his positions were on anything, but they knew he liked golf. So in the skit in the Gridiron Club, the reporters are reduced to interviewing his caddy to find out his views. So one of them says to the caddy, how's he stand on antitrust? Caddy says, there ain't an ounce of anti in that man, he trusts everybody. So that was part of his magic. He wasn't against things, he was for things. And he trusted you until you demonstrated you weren't trustworthy, and then you were out of there. But that was an interesting little passage. But you do work hard, but it's enjoyable. You feel you have a chance to work on issues that are of huge importance, and that's a privilege and an opportunity. So you enjoy that. But my wife and I had a deal. Washington is a very social place. There are embassies always giving parties. There are tons of parties, and you can go every night and have a dinner party, and they're all fun, good talk. But we decided, no, we're working too hard. If we're invited to the White House, you go. Invited to the Vice President's house, you go. If you're invited to an embassy substituting for the president, that is, if the president gives a party and then the visiting president has a party for him and he can't go, then I would go and stand in for the president. Other than that, no dinners. When I get through, take a deep breath, go home, have a drink with my wife and a little supper, and that was our life. And I think, in a way, you have to sort of school yourself a little bit, or you do, as President Iyer said, you burn yourself out, and you have to have some downtime. So you don't do that.
Closing out on golf, the last time you shot a hole-in-one?
I shot a hole-in-one at the San Francisco Golf Club about 5 or 6 years ago. I can't play anymore. I'm almost 98 years old now, so I can't swing. But I did get that hole-in-one. And I got it not too long after I got a new left knee. And Bill Maloney was the surgeon who did it here at Stanford. He's a great guy. So he had a new setup, orthopedic setup, and he asked me to come and speak at the dedication of his setup. So I went and I said, how many people here play golf? Most of the hands went up. I said, how many have had a hole-in-one? Nobody. I said, well, everybody wants a hole-in-one. Let me tell you how you get one. If you're a right-handed golfer, you swing against your left knee. So I'm a right-handed golfer. So I got a new left knee from Bill Maloney. I went out to San Francisco Golf Club. I come to number 13. It's a tricky little par 3 because the green is surrounded by traps. If you hit it too short, you're in a trap. If you hit it too hard, you're in a trap. So it's a tough little hole. So I got up on the tee and I flexed my knee, Bill Maloney's knee, picked out a 5-iron. I thought that was the right club. And I swung against Bill's knee and I hit it just right. And I could see the ball land on the green and go into the cup. So if you want to get a hole-in-one, get a new knee from Bill Maloney.